Welcome to this How To Academy event with me, Matt Stadlen. I'm a presenter on LBC, National Radio Programme, National Radio Station. Leading Britain's Conversation is what it stands for. Very pleased to have so many of you with us from right around the world, and absolutely delighted to introduce to you a man who really doesn't need much of an introduction, Sir Ronald Cohen. He's a businessman, he's also a philanthropist, and he's, of course, an impact investor. He's written this book called Impact, not his first book, but I'm sure it's going to have precisely that, an impact, because it is very topical as we now look to reshape our world and reshape capitalism. He's also the chairman of the Portland Trust and also of Bridges Ventures. And he's been called and described various things, all of them good throughout his career, including father of British venture capitalism, also the father of social investment. So this conversation is all about how to reshape capitalism and drive real change. Ronald, very good to have you with us at How To Academy. I think for the first time. You're in Tel Aviv, I'm in London, people, as I say, right around the world. And this is an international question, how we reshape capitalism. I wonder whether you might just start by, in synthesis, just in 2 or 3 minutes, explaining what moved you to write the book in the first place.
Absolutely, Matt. Wonderful to be here with you and with all of you in this discussion. I started off thinking that I could help reduce inequality by becoming a venture capitalist. I could back people who came from nothing to enrich themselves and to enrich those who worked with them. And I realized as time went on, Matt, that far from reducing inequality, this was actually increasing it. And so I began to think about how we deal with issues like poverty. And the government asked me in 2000, out of the blue, to head up a task force on social investment. And then I began to look in detail at our system. And I came to the conclusion that the world was changing, that we were shifting from just thinking about profit to thinking about impact. So you see it in the behavior of young people who don't buy the products of companies whose values they don't espouse or won't work for certain companies. And you see it in the behavior of investors. So there's 30 to 40 trillion dollars today, between a third and half of all professionally managed money, which goes to achieve more than just profit, trying to achieve impact, environmental improvement, social improvement. And so I began to realize that something was changing out of necessity. People were beginning to realize that we can't continue as we are. We're digging a deeper and deeper hole for ourselves, environmentally and socially. And governments are trying to tax us to deal with it, but there'll never be enough money to repair the damage that we're creating, that companies are creating. And so I began to think about how do we change that? And I came to the conclusion that you needed to change the system. You couldn't just tinker with it. You needed to bring improvement in people's lives and the planet alongside profit to drive our economies. And so I began 3 years ago to write this book, which in a nutshell says, not only should we do this, not only can we do this, but it's actually already happening. Investors are already assessing the environmental damage that companies cause. And if you look at the value of companies and the environmental damage they cause, you'll see the ones who cause more damage are worth less on the stock market. And what we need now is to push hard to give us all transparency. We have the right to know what impact companies are having, good and bad, just as we have a right to know what profit they're making.
So explain to us very briefly, in a little more detail though than you have already, what was wrong with the old model? It's presumably all about impact, but negative impact.
Yes, what's wrong about the old model is that companies in their pursuit of profit can create billions of dollars of damage. Take a company like Associated British Foods that brings us Twinings tea. When we buy a box of Twinings tea, we don't realize that this big British company is delivering $1.8 billion of environmental damage a year against $1.6 billion of profit. And so the existing system, by ignoring the impact that we create, good and bad, encourages companies to just continue to make money without worrying about anything else. And so out of negligence as much as anything else, we see the huge climate issues that we face today, and we see the huge inequalities that we face today.
How critical are you of venture capitalism that was born after the Second World War? You were one of the world's biggest, strongest, most powerful venture capitalists yourself. I think one of your funds managed to raise 5 billion euros, which is a staggering sum of money. Were you aware, as you were raising money and investing at that time, prior to this new incarnation, where you are championing impact, were you aware that some of the companies that your teams were investing in were indeed having a negative impact?
Well, we had impact values even in 1981 when we raised our first fund, because we said to our investors, we will not invest in defense companies, in gambling companies, or in companies manufacturing alcohol or cigarettes. So there were some simple impact guidelines, if you like, even then. And we did create a lot of companies that did a lot of good. Created jobs and served customers. Waterstone's bookshops, or the company that cloned Dolly the sheep, Autonomy, the high-tech company. So we created employment and we created wealth. I'm actually very proud of what the venture capital industry has achieved, because the tech revolution, which has transformed our lives, could not have happened without a source of capital that was prepared to be hands-on and help entrepreneurs develop their businesses, prepared to be patient as long as 10 years or more, prepared to take high risk. And of course, it's gone from being a tiny field when I kicked off to being, together with private equity, which funds buyouts and so on, more than a $5 trillion field now. Now, you mentioned the 5 billion euro fund that I raised before I left Apex in 2005. Since then, Apex has raised an 11 billion euro fund. Well, my first fund was 10 million pounds, if you can believe it.
Well, you mentioned that, and I think we should, just before we delve deeper into the impact revolution, I think address or mention your extraordinary personal story, because you came to this country as a Jewish boy from Egypt as an 11-year-old with 10 Egyptian pounds in your pocket. I think each member of your family had 10 Egyptian pounds with them. Right. And yet somehow you managed to get into Oxford University, and from there you went to Harvard and so forth. You were president even of the Oxford Union, which is an astonishing immigrant success story. What do you credit that? I mean, how did that actually come about? Your father, I think, went to the headmaster of one of the schools you attended and said, listen, I think you should take my boy. I'm not just saying it because he's my son, but if you do take him, he'll become head of the class. And you did end up head of the class. So was it partly your father's drive? Do you think it was something inside you, the desperation to succeed or to impress your father? What was going on that skyrocketed you to where you were in your 20s and 30s?
Well, there's no doubt that if you want to be motivated, you should emigrate, preferably at an early age, because you're faced with challenges. And once you've overcome them, everything else seems relatively easier. That's one aspect of it. And there's no doubt in my mind that what my father said to the headmaster of this grammar school, Orange Hill Grammar School in Burnt Oak, the end of the Edgware line, made a deep impression on me. I knew my parents were having to face a big challenge in their new home, and I couldn't let the sight down. But if you ask me what is my lasting impression of these years, it's an impression of gratitude. Gratitude that I was welcomed in that school. Gratitude that there was a teacher called Richard Farley, bless his soul, who thought I could get into Oxford and who coached me for the entrance exams. Gratitude that I could go to a university where the state paid for my education, that I could get a scholarship to go to Harvard Business School. I could never have afforded that. And so perhaps part of my values have been spurred in the direction of giving back by my own personal experience. But it was also the values of my family, that if you were lucky enough to do well in some way, then you should share that with people who were less well off than yourself.
You say in the book that in your 20s, you just dived into the world of finance, and people would say, well, you haven't got nearly enough experience. And even then, at such a young age, you rebutted that and thought you've got to get in there and swim in these challenging waters and then sink or swim. And there's an analogy there for the present in this impact revolution. You think the time for this is now. We've just got to all get stuck in. And as we'll discover as we continue to talk, there's a role here, not just for CEOs, not just for businessmen and women, not just for investors, but also for us as sort of small scale investors. If we think about our own pension funds, I mean, this is a revolution that you want to involve everybody in.
That's absolutely right. And there are parallels with venture capital and the tech revolution, Matt. In the early days of venture capital, people thought I was crazy. That Britons couldn't be successful entrepreneurs, that it was a US phenomenon, that the fear of failure in the UK would inhibit people from becoming successful entrepreneurs. They just wouldn't take high enough risks. And we had to persuade investors that no, human nature was the same everywhere. If you gave people the opportunity to take risk and to reap rewards, people would take it wherever they are. And the same is true of impact investment today. People say, well, how can you change human nature, which is profit seeking, to seek to do good and do well at the same time, to seek impact at the same time as profit? Well, the evidence is that's where the values are going today. As I was mentioning, that's where young entrepreneurs are going. They want to create businesses that do good and do well at the same time.
So let's look at some of these impact entrepreneurs at that end of the scale. Do you think that they are aware of themselves as impact entrepreneurs? They see themselves as part of that movement?
So there have always been people who have gone into business with a higher motive. And in retrospect, you'd say they were impact entrepreneurs. But the definition of impact entrepreneurship or impact investment involves measuring the impact that you create so that you don't just steer your business to achieve maximum profit. You achieve it to achieve maximum impact and profit. And so I would say that a large number of entrepreneurs are now becoming aware of the need to take a venture which could naturally deliver impact in the direction of defining impact goals and measuring their performance in achieving them. I seldom see a business plan today that doesn't have a section on impact. I mean, that didn't exist, 40 years ago.
So let me throw you a challenging question. I mentioned it to you before we started broadcasting. This is from a friend who spends a lot of time looking into the ways that we can have a more positive impact, specifically on the environment with climate change in mind. And his was a rather cynical response when I invited him to join this event this evening. He said that the convenient idea that the profit motive is the way to solve our relationship with the natural world, because you talk in the book about the environment and about our responsibilities towards the planet and thereby to each other. But he says the convenient idea that the profit motive is the way to solve our relationship with the natural world is the most valid, or rather vapid delusion. What do you say to that? I mean, in other words, can profit really have a role in changing the world for the better, or do we have to look beyond that?
I've thought hard about that. Obviously, there have been other economic systems, communism, being one. They have not proved to be successful. So I've come to the conclusion that the challenge is to channel market forces and capital and entrepreneurship in the direction of creating positive improvement in planet and people's lives, rather than foregoing the power of that capitalist engine. Now, some people, like your friend, believe that you can't ride two horses, profit and impact. I believe you can harness two horses. I certainly would like to ride two horses, but I believe you can harness two horses. And so I would say to your friend, okay, do you have a better suggestion for an economic system that's going to achieve rising prosperity, a fairer distribution of income, and regeneration of our natural resources?
Because without profit, the world can't really function, can it?
You see, profit provides the incentive that drives our economies. And that incentive is a very powerful incentive. I knew that I had to make myself financially independent because I would have to look after my parents. So I had to go for a certain type of career where I could make a certain amount of money. That financial incentive is a very real thing. The problem is that if you solely focus on that incentive and don't worry about all the harm you do, and nobody holds you accountable for that harm or rewards you for the social good or the environmental good that you do, you'll just continue to think about profit only, and you get to the system that we have now.
And actually, in the book, you quote someone very heavily involved, maybe the leader, I think, of the Japan government's pension investment fund, who talks about the importance, I think, of profitability, but also of impact.
Absolutely. Hiro Mizuno, who runs the biggest pension fund in the world, says exactly that. And I think if your friend had a better solution, we'd all be very happy to listen to it. But just decrying the current system and hoping that somehow the environment's going to get better is obviously, or social issues are going to get better, is just not a reasonable way to proceed. Whereas, Matt, if you look at a company today as an investment, and you look at its profit performance, and it's going like that, upwards. And then you look at its impact performance, say it's a coal company. Environmentally, it's going down. It's just digging a deeper hole for humanity through all of the CO2 emissions that it is causing. If investors begin to shy away from those companies and to go into renewable energy companies whose value shoots up like that, the system will take care of those who are not doing well in terms of impact. So you can use investor power, you can use consumer power, you can use your power as an employee, which is where everyone on this call comes in one of these three dimensions. You can even use the pension fund into which you make contributions and about which I doubt that you have any idea, about the portfolio that it has constructed. and how much it's polluting and how much it's creating in terms of social issues around investing in companies that use child labor and so on, you can write to your pension fund manager and say, I'd like to know how much of my portfolio is going into environmental, social, and governance investing and impact investing.
Let's look at how the old system, as you describe it, worked in order perhaps better to understand the new system and the motivations. Because essentially in the old system, you might get people who were hugely successful, made their money, sometimes in ways that you might describe as dirty or certainly ethically compromising. And then they go into philanthropy, so that then go and dish out thousands, sometimes millions of pounds in perhaps ways that might salve their consciences. Now, is there a little bit of that going on here with modern day companies who realize that they have to at least nod to the world of impact, to the ethos of impact?
Yeah.
In other words, how real is this movement? Obviously, if you're going to start a company because you want to, as you give an example in the book, you want to make medicine more available in Rwanda or whatever, so you develop a drone company that can deliver medicine, something along those lines, fine, then you can easily see how you're targeting profit but also positive impact. But if you're a big fossil fuel company and you say, okay, well, we're going to spend a bit of money on this, or we're going to look into renewables here, or we're going to, then you kind of get the sense that that's sort of the old model reincarnated.
Well, the thing is this, Matt, our values didn't create the system. The system has created our values. So it's become acceptable to make money however you can. I mean, obviously by staying on the right side of the law, but in terms of environmental damage or organizations in your supply line that are using child labor, don't believe in gender equality, don't pay minimum wages, don't give benefits, and so on, becomes the norm. Now, we are, through impact, redefining the meaning of success. Success is no longer, it will no longer be just making money. Success will also be what contribution you made. And you will have a transparent way of measuring that contribution. Now, you asked a very basic question about human motivation. And some people do things for moral reasons, out of altruism, out of empathy, and others do things in a more self-seeking way for prudential reasons. But your system has to infuse its values with both of those strands. So we're not going to be able to persuade cynics who just want to make money to become idealistic. But we can incentivize them to deliver impact at the same time because it's in their personal interest if they want their companies to grow. And over time, as they get used to delivering impact, we can hope that the values of the system that defines success and recognition in terms of contribution rather than just money begins to change behavior more broadly, sets new norms for our society. But if you don't have transparency on the impact, everybody can talk about it, and claim to be delivering positive impact while they're doing terrible things in the background.
Incentive, as you say, is essential here. So, for example, with climate change, at some point, companies are going to realize that if they don't act ethically, then we're all going to get wiped out, or not wiped out, but life is going to become very, very much more challenging than it already is. And so it's in everyone's interest, including the CEOs and the boards and the people who work at the companies, to do things better. One obvious way of incentivizing businesses to act with a positive impact and be part of this impact revolution is for governmental interaction. And that's an important theme in the book as well, the role that governments have. And you've interacted with government. You touched on this earlier with one of these task force. You did a task force for the British government, but you went on to do a task force at the invitation of David Cameron for the G8, so on an international scale. If companies know that should they not act in a more ethical way, they may later, and perhaps not in the too distant future, be subject to very significant punitive taxes. There you have an incentive right there.
Exactly, Matt. If you look today at a company without measuring its impact and you tax its profit only, it's unfair. What you really should be doing is you should be comparing the profit and the impact. And if a company is delivering net impact, positive impact, costed, its employment impact, its product impact, its operational impact on people and planet, you take the pluses and the minuses and you come to a bottom line, perhaps that company gets taxed for its profit less the positive impact it has created. And the company which is delivering 10 billion or 100 billion or a billion or a million of negative impact pays tax not just on its profit, but on its negative impact as well, because they're the ones causing the harm. And so you begin to reallocate government expenditure away from cleaning rivers and trying to deal with investment to reduce pollution and all the rest of it, to areas like education and giving people a better break in life, as I was fortunate, found myself in a position to.
So without measurement, you can't get management, can you?
Exactly.
So give us some examples of how we can measure impact. Is this a self-regulating thing? I'm going to talk, of course, there about the involvement of government. How do companies, and crucially their investors, measure the positive impact?
So we need government to mandate that starting 2 years from now, every company must publish its impact and reflect it in its financial accounts so that investors can look at their profit before the impact they've created and with the impact they've created. And then let investors decide where they want to go. Now, it would be perverse for an investor who wants to invest in the chemical industry to pick a company that creates damage equivalent to 140% of its profit, rather than a company that delivers 10% damage relative to its profit. And over time, the one delivering 10% is going to try to eliminate it because investors will flock to it. So if we can look at issues like the environment or diversity, for instance, look at diversity, ethnic diversity, gender diversity, and so on. And if we can measure the number of people within an organization from these different ethnic backgrounds relative to the area surrounding the demographics in the area surrounding the facilities of a company. And we know that a certain number of people are missing at every echelon of the business. And we multiply that number by the salary level that person would have got. Then you have a cost to the community that has been excluded. When you begin to measure that for companies, you begin to create a race to the top. They want to improve their impact-weighted profit. So they're going to start improving diversity. It's the power of investors and consumers and employees that is going to take them in that direction. No amount of talking about, oh, you should do this because it's morally better, you'll be more responsible. So it's going to persuade, it's going to provide enough of an incentive relative to making money.
Now, some of the people, Ronnie, who are watching this conversation right now will be entrepreneurs. Some of them may be CEOs, but lots of us are just plain old people like me who are low-level investors, investing our shillings from our hard-earned income in the stock market, for example. How possible is it in this world, as we find it today, to invest ethically? Isn't it almost impossible, in fact, impossible? to
No,
live a totally ethical life. Let me just give you a very quick example.
yeah.
So if I invest in a FTSE 100 tracker, an incredibly standard thing to do, and I'm not giving financial advice, I'm just saying what I do, and I believe that I'm sure there are lots of other people who do it as well. How guilty should I feel about that? And where do I draw the line? If I go to my broker and say, well, would you mind finding me a tracker that takes out defense, for example, or tobacco, where do you stop? Because if I still put petrol in my car, or if I pay taxes to the British government, it's the British government ultimately gives the licenses for defense systems, defense companies to sell arms to dictatorships. Do you see what I mean? So, you know, how aspirational should we be? And where do we really stop and start with this? Because we could end up despairing.
Look, I think we should be aspirational, and I think we should focus on doing what is possible today. What is possible today is for you, instead of investing in FTSE 100, which has tobacco companies and drinks companies and defense companies, gambling companies in it, while you have the opportunity to invest in an index that doesn't, you know, the question is for you, how would you feel more comfortable investing in the FTSE that you're in, or investing in another index that excludes these companies? I imagine your answer would be, well, if I knew that was available, then I would certainly invest in it. Well, it is available now. I don't know about the FTSE, but certainly in the US, there are ESG indices. I'm sure in the UK there are ESG indices that you can invest in. So if you begin to inquire of your broker, of your pension fund manager, where can I invest in a way that's consistent with my values, then your savings will save lives, basically, and improve the environment.
Let's look at big corporations. I mean, that's a salutary point, and it's something that I wrestle with and will continue to think very hard about. And I think the message that you have there really can be transformative and should be broadcast loud and clear. Let's look at big corporations themselves. So existing companies that are already enormous, making a huge amount of profit. How can we turn those tankers around? In the book, you give examples like Coca-Cola and Nestle, who are already trying to do things in a way that is better for society. Flesh out one or two of those examples, and how easy is it, as I say, to get big companies to do things differently?
Coca-Cola comes out, actually, it's Pepsi-Cola that comes out better than Coca-Cola because it has 2.5 times the sales and less environmental damage. Coca-Cola, because of its water usage, comes out quite poorly. But the way to change it is transparency. You can't hold companies accountable if you don't have transparency over their impact performance. But they're not going to do that unless they have to. You know, in 1929, investors realized they were investing in companies without understanding the profit they made because there weren't accepted accounting principles. And then when the US government started in 1933 to make it compulsory to provide transparency for investors on the profits the companies were really making, people complained that this was going to be the end of American capitalism. And it's actually this transparency and the confidence that it has brought investors that's led to the huge financial markets we have today. We have a right to know, we have a right to transparency now on the impact that companies create. If you have that transparency, management will become aware of it, of the impact it is creating. Management, middle management, workers, investors, everyone will be watching these figures like hawks. Objectives will be set to improve that performance. One thing I'm sure of, Matt, if the British government decided that in order to emerge from the COVID crisis in better shape and sooner, we need to bring companies and investors alongside government to help solve these environmental and social issues, and mandated that 2 years from now, every company will have to publish accounts that show the impact the company has created. Companies would start now to get their act in order.
Well, I'm pleased you brought COVID into this, because I wonder whether you feel that we now have the opportunity to live in an age of greater self-awareness and greater social accountability, given the responsibilities that have been imposed upon us, forced upon us by the virus, and our need to commit to each other and each other's health.
I think absolutely COVID is having that type of an influence. I also think that it is shaking a lot of our habits and beliefs and leading to a lot of questioning of capitalism and even democracy. So it provides an opportunity similar to the one that appeared in 1929 to change our system for the better. We had inequality, Matt, that was erupting in violence in different countries that in a way was expressed through Brexit before COVID. Imagine what COVID is going to do to inequality, where all the stimulus packages are going to be directed at creating better incentives for big companies and big financial institutions, leaving the most vulnerable behind. It's going to exacerbate inequality. And so governments who are going to appear or going to emerge from the crisis laden with even more debt, national debt, than they had before, are going to be confronted with even greater scale of social and environmental challenges. They need impact transparency to bring companies and investors on side to provide solutions.
So far, we've sort of been talking about politics, but with a small p. So if we capitalise that p, I'm curious to know where this impact revolution fits in on the political spectrum. So would your thrust here of the movement make you, for example, a socialist? I mean, where does higher taxation come in?
So I like to say that I was always more about policy than about politics, party politics. In fact, in my career, I started out as a liberal. I supported the Labour Party, and I ended up being supported and supporting the Conservative Party. So I vote according to the policies of different governments. Now, what's been very encouraging about impact is that people on the left wing have said, okay, this is a fairer way to treat people and to deal with the environment. And people on the right hand side of the aisle have tended to say, okay, this is a way to direct government expenditure to become more effective, to worry about outcomes, to use the tools of impact investment, payment on the basis of outcomes for services delivered. And so far there has been bipartisan support for impact policies.
But it does beg this question, doesn't it? Again, and I mentioned this earlier in terms of how we choose to invest. And I think it's incredibly powerful, the idea that we can save lives from our laptops, depending on where we invest. But you read stories today, the England football player Marcus Rashford has popped up again. He managed to force one of those government U-turns, one of the 11 so far of Boris Johnson's government, I think, and counting, by getting school meals to be free in the summer holidays as well. But he's popped up again today, giving the example of a mother that he talked to who was surviving with her 2 young children on 3 slices of bread a day. Now, how does the impact revolution impact on those people? How can we draw that connection?
So the impact revolution brings a new set of financing instruments to charitable organizations, where government does not deal with the most vulnerable in the way that it should, is where philanthropists step in. And today, charities in the UK are strapped for cash and small because they rely on donations, basically, and grants from foundations. And typically, donors will support a charity for 2 or 3 years, and then move on to another one because there's so much need everywhere. Now, what impact investment started with was the idea in 2000, when we published the Social Investment Task Force report, that it should be possible to bring investment to those who want to improve lives, since we've been successful in bringing it to those who want to make money. And that's where we invented the social impact bond, the famous Peterborough bond, to reduce the number of prisoners from Peterborough prison who were going back into jail after their release. And so the power of impact investment is that it enables us to fund the charities as well as businesses. And so an entrepreneur today who wants to tackle the social issue has, if you like, the choice of saying, do I want to do it through a profit with purpose model, or do I want to do it through a charitable model?
So let's speak a little bit more about philanthropy, because in the book you differentiate between old school philanthropists and impact philanthropists, that word again.
Yes, what I mention in the book is that philanthropy, where it involves big foundations like the Wellcome Foundation or Esme Fairbairn Foundation or the Rowntree Foundation in the UK, has traditionally invested its capital, because these big foundations have big endowment funds, as they're called, in a way to make profit and then use the returns on those investments in order to do good by giving away money. And impact philanthropy says you can't give away 2 or 3 or 4% of the assets you have every year, which is part of the return you've made on them, and then with the other 97%, go invest in companies that are polluting and creating social issues. You have to invest your endowment in a way that is consistent with your social mission. So we're beginning to see in the United States, for instance, the Ford Foundation allocate $1 billion out of its $14 billion endowment to impact investment. That's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is that I know many people on this call will agree that when they give money to charity, they're very unsure of what that money actually achieves. It's almost a biblical gift. When you give coins to a beggar, you don't ask the beggar what they're going to do with it, okay? But here, big foundations and big philanthropists have an obligation to make sure that money achieves the maximum impact they can. And to do this, they can use the new tools of impact investment. One of these tools is outcomes funds. What does that mean? It means that a charity would, instead of giving a grant, say, to an educational service delivery organization helping children to stay in school instead of dropping out, the charity would agree to pay according to the number of children who stayed in rather than dropped out. And what that does, on the basis of the agreement with the charity that it will receive payments, the charity is able to raise investment capital, which comes with additional help, with a focus on targets, and delivers much better results. And that's where the social impact bond meets the outcomes fund. Now, I'll give you an example in India of a charity which raised just $250,000 impact bond to prevent young girls from dropping out of school before the age of 12. It beat the targets in its contract by 160%. You know what the consequence was, Matt? They raised $100 million of philanthropic capital because the philanthropist could now measure what this charity was doing. And so that's what impact philanthropy is all about. Focusing on outcomes rather than activities. Attracting investment capital against the promise to pay, creating pay for success incentives, and using your capital to achieve your mission, not just part of the return from it.
And so let's return briefly to government. I mean, you've worked with governments, as I said earlier on in our conversation, many times. You worked with the New Labour government. Jack Straw at one point, I think, thumped the table and said that we're going to do this. And this was in relation to prisoners and trying to make sure that they didn't reoffend. And you had a relationship with the government there. The incentive for government, of course, to get involved is that there's less of a mess for government to clear up later on if they are proactive and preemptive.
Absolutely. And often there's a saving or an increase in revenue for the government. So if you prevent a young prisoner from going back to prison after 18 months and doing so several times after that, you save the government money by saving money in law courts and in prisons. But the government also makes money because if the prisoner's been trained to go into a job, the prisoner begins to pay tax. So the government is in a way foregoing part of the saving or the increase in revenue that it is getting to pay investors a return, which is a reasonable return, it's a capped return. The innovation here, Matt, is for the first time in 2010, we created in the UK a social impact bond, which is an investment where the return depends on achieving a measurable social good. Today, there are over nearly 200 social impact bonds in 30 countries, tackling 15 different social issues.
You give a blueprint in the book of what governments need to do. I'm not going to ask you to remember all 9 of the points that you recommend, but just give us a gist of the way forward.
Well, the first one is to provide transparency on the impact that companies create. Transparency and accountability go together. If we want to hold companies accountable for the harm they do and reward them for the good they do, we need to know it. So that's recommendation number 1. Recommendation number 2 is appoint a government minister to be in charge of impact. What David Cameron did was to use his cabinet office to push the impact agenda forward. All of his talk about big society was really springing from a realization that government can no longer do this alone. The scale of the consequences arising from our economic system is such that we need to change the way in which the system operates. And so it wasn't defined then in the way in which we can define it now in my book. We didn't talk in terms of, well, the social impact bond actually optimized risk, return, and impact for the first time. But we can do this within our whole economy if we measure impact. In the social impact bond, you measure the number of prisoners. And in the economy, you measure the cost of the impact that a company creates. And by measuring that cost, you bring impact to the center of the economic system. Now, if you don't have a minister, a senior minister in government, pushing this new agenda in the way in which ministers pushed entrepreneurship and venture capital to create jobs in the 80s, then you're not going to get there as quickly.
I want to introduce a couple of big names to the conversation, again, briefly, because we don't have a huge amount of time. One of them is Adam Smith, and one of them is Elon Musk. Let's deal first with Adam Smith. You referenced 2 of his books in your book, and you wonder what he would have made of this revolution today and how 2 of those books could have been read or seen in combination.
Yeah, most people will know that Adam Smith was the 18th century economist who famously said, if everybody looks after their own economic interest, the invisible hand of the market will make sure that everybody benefits. So buyers and sellers, the invisible hand of the market. But he was prouder of his first book, Matt, called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, than he was of The Wealth of Nations. And in fact, I've seen a picture of his gravestone, and The Theory of Moral Sentiments appears first. The Theory of Moral Sentiments sought to understand how economies and individuals worked through altruism and empathy. Now, had he understood that technology and big data in the 21st century would enable us to measure impact, I say that he would have thought of the invisible heart of markets guiding their invisible hand, and perhaps would have merged his two books, The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations.
So Elon Musk is a good news story, essentially, in terms of his ability to combine profit with really a transformative series of innovations.
Yeah, I mean, he is a controversial figure, but nobody can deny that his motivation went beyond making money to weaning us off the combustion engine and the pollution that it causes. And he has successfully achieved that. Not only has he built Tesla into a company that's worth today more than General Motors, but in the process, he has shifted the whole of the automobile industry across the world to electric and hybrid vehicles. That is a real impact investment. Now, if you begin to bring transparency on impact into Tesla, and you measure how much environmental harm is being done in the process of creating the batteries that power Tesla cars, you may come to a different view about the net impact that he is creating. He's saving emissions from cars on the one hand, but in the process, he's creating emissions to make batteries. People attack him because they claim that if you took that environmental impact from creating batteries into account, it would seriously reduce the positive impact that's created by saving carbon emissions from vehicles. But we need to know. We have a right to know. For me, he is today an iconic example of what an impact venture and an impact entrepreneur is.
Before I ask you some questions from the Q&A, just to make sure that we've got all of our terms here ticked off, and of course there's jargon and lots of technical language in the book, but it's very clearly explained. There's a triple helix which is central to all of this. I haven't named it specifically, and that involves risk, return, and impact. So just briefly explain that to us.
So if you think about it, in the 19th century and before, when investors made an investment decision, they thought of the profit they could make, and risk was in the background, but you couldn't measure risk. And then in the middle of the last century, we shifted from just measuring return to measuring risk and return. And we began to look at how much a share had gone up and down, how much a bond had gone up and down, categories of shares and bonds. And investors began to think in terms of risk-adjusted returns. That transformed portfolios. It actually opened the door for my career in venture capital, because this had been viewed as a very high-risk activity. But with the new risk thinking, people began to understand that it may be higher risk, but if it delivers a higher return that is, on a risk-adjusted basis, more attractive than a lower risk investment, you should have it in the portfolio. And that created diversification. That's the second strand of the helix. Today, the triple helix refers to risk, return, and impact. And if we measure impact in the way that we measure risk, and we can certainly measure it better than we measure risk, and the way we measure return, and probably we will measure it less well than we measure return, but sufficiently dependably that we can make comparisons between companies, then this triple helix begins to power a different type of individual in our society, in business, in investment, and in everything else.
And there's another triple helix, though you don't call it that, and that's about accountability, community, and gratitude. I mean, there's a real payoff here in doing the right thing.
I think there is, and I think we're in the process by bringing this transparency of redefining the meaning of profit, of the value of companies, and of success, shifting it to individuals being judged not just according to the money they make, but according to the contribution they make to lives and to the planet.
So a couple of good specific questions from the Q&A. Christelle says, I'm a mental health tech entrepreneur, 100% committed on reducing at large international scale the mental health crisis. So this is, as she describes it, a large impact project. Yet looking for a Series A round in Europe, I realized that psychology / mental health is not considered serious enough, a field, by VC analysts who are more hard facts than soft facts, topic sensitive. What would Sir Ronald recommend?
So Chris, I would say that you're exactly where you want to be as an entrepreneur. The COVID crisis has created huge psychological pressure. There are lots of platforms being created now to bring psychological help to people. Group therapy with a moderator on Zoom is spreading. There are other ways of bringing individual therapists to help. Again, on Zoom. So what you have to show is that you can both improve the lives of people and deliver a profit. Now, my view is that if you have a risk-return impact venture, you will deliver better returns than somebody who focuses only on risk and return. So you have the opportunity to attract better talent, more loyal clients, and more loyal investors who will pay more for your venture if you can show that you can deliver both. Just define the right business model to solve the very important problem you've set out to solve.
Mehdi's keen, and he's written in to make sure that we are sufficiently clear about the distinction between environmental impact and ethical investment. But actually the two go hand in hand, don't they?
Yes, I mean, there's a multitude of terms, and ethical investment has included environmental as well as social. The problem with ethical investment in its traditional form is nothing was measured. So you didn't really have the information to make an intelligent decision. Impact investment, on the other hand, implies by its own definition that you measure the impact. You set clear impact goals and you measure their achievement. And so I would say that ethical investment, like ESG investment, was the first wave. And now we have the second wave rising, which involves bringing measurement to both ethical and ESG investment, impact measurement.
And just quickly, this anonymous attendee says the current administration in the United States is loosening regulations, which has, amongst other things, a negative impact on environmental standards generally. While this is current US government policy, do you see any negative impact, or while this is the policy, do you see any negative impact on monies flowing into impact investments in the United States? Or is it the reverse? In other words, is impact investing now a structural force?
Impact investment is becoming a structural force. I would say that ESG investing has undoubtedly become a structural force if it represents, as I see the numbers, 30 to 50% of all professionally managed assets of $85 trillion. Impact investment is not yet a structural force. It'll get to $1 trillion. If you look at the world of venture capital and private equity, it's got to $5 trillion as a pool today. But impact investment will become all investment within just a few years. The minute you bring impact transparency and you measure the impact performance of companies alongside their profit performance, all of the ESG investing will become impact investing. So unlike venture capital and private equity, which ended up being a segment of a market, impact measurement will spread throughout every asset class, throughout our whole financial system. And that's why In the book, the title of the book is Impact, but the subtitle is Reshaping Capitalism to Drive Real Change.
I want to finish with two questions, Sir Ronald. One of them is measurement of ourselves. So how do we measure our own impact? Many of us might be quite anxious about our footprint, and possibly rightly so. You talk about measurement within corporations, but do you think we can actually reasonably and profitably measure our own impact? And have you spent any time measuring your own impact?
Of course. I mean, so when you talk in terms of air travel, for instance, and you realize that Lufthansa and American Airlines would be loss-making if you charged against their profit the environmental damage they cause every year. And as I did, you fly every week to a different corner of the world in pursuit of impact. And then you have to think of how you can palliate the damage you're causing. Now, you can do it by purchasing carbon offsets, which plant trees in different parts of the world. Or you can think in terms of reducing your air travel and doing these meetings on Zoom. I think as you become aware of impact created by companies, you become directly aware of the impact that you're creating directly every day. But you're creating negative impact by buying the products of the wrong companies. And that's a huge power that each of us has in changing the behavior of companies.
So my final question is this. I suppose my takeaway message from this, and it's been absolutely fascinating hearing your views, is that this is urgent. This is for the now, it's not to be delayed. But also that just because we can't be perfect, any of us, doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive very hard to be better. What's your closing message to everyone listening or watching in terms of the impact that they can make from now on?
My message is you can, first of all, spread the word. All royalties from impact are going to impact charities. Get people to understand what we've been talking about in today's chat. And number two, to the extent that you're aware of companies and what damage they're causing, leave the companies as employees that you disagree, whose management you disagree with, whose values you disagree with, and let us only purchase the products of companies that deliver less harm or preferably do good. Thirdly, if you have a pension plan, write to your pension fund manager, ask them to invest in ESG and impact investments. And finally, let's all push for transparency. Transparency is a human right. We have the right to know not only the profit that companies make, but the impact that they have on lives and on the planet.
Sir Ronald Cohen, it's been wonderful to spend the last hour with you. Fantastic to meet you properly, even though you're in Israel. And it's just another example of the incredible spread of the tech revolution that we've been able to endure this pandemic, partly thanks to Zoom. And if you've enjoyed this, and Sir Ronald's book, of course, is available, Impact, as you've heard, and I strongly recommend it. If you've enjoyed this conversation, I'll be back on Thursday with the How To Academy, talking to another man with an also extraordinary, very different story, Dylan Hartley, who captained England to Grand Slam glory under Eddie Jones. And his tale is also truly astonishing. I read an interview with him in the Telegraph recently. You can't quite believe it. But for now, thank you for joining us wherever you are in the world. Stay well, stay safe. And Sir Ronald, it's been brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much.